This plane, which came crashing down onto a field on the outskirts of Moscow, is believed to have carried a passenger who took on none other than Russian President Vladimir Putin. We are talking about Yevgeny Prigozhin, chief of the mercenary Wagner group. Russia insists his name was on the passenger list of the plane that crashed and killed all 10 people on board. But if he is indeed dead, it's going to raise more questions than answers and put the spotlight on Putin's ruthless power.
Я сообщаю официально.
The Wagner Group and their boss Yevgeny Prigozhin shocked the world when they revolted against the Russian government led by Vladimir Putin. Wagner troops took control of 2 Russian cities and were just 200 kilometers away from capital Moscow before a deal was brokered between Prigozhin and Kremlin via Belarusian President Lukashenko. Wagner troops made an about turn, but for a brief while, Putin's mercenaries essentially pulled the rug from under his feet.
Однако организаторы мятежа, предав свою страну, свой народ, предали и тех, кого втянули в преступление, лгали им, толкали их на смерть под огонь, на то, чтобы стрелять в своих.
The man helming the mutiny was Yevgeny Prigozhin, the most well-known private military operator in the world.
У нас нехватка боеприпасов! 70%!
Who is where he is now, thanks to his closeness to Putin. But his beginnings were rough. In the 1980s, Prigozhin spent nearly a decade in prison over a robbery case. When he got out, he set up a chain of stalls selling hot dogs in St. Petersburg. Business went well, and within a few years, he was able to open restaurants in the city. One of his restaurants, called New Island, was frequented by Putin, and that's where the two first met. Later, Prigozhin's catering company was contracted to supply food to the Kremlin, earning him the nickname Putin Chef. Somewhere in 2014, when Russia was annexing the Crimea region of Ukraine, Prigozhin pitched the idea of a private military to Putin. The idea was to do whatever the Kremlin needed to be done, but with deniability, so that nothing can be directly attributed to Putin. That's how the Wagner Group came into being. On paper, it's supposed to be a private military company, but their nature of work goes far beyond that. Like setting up a troll farm which interfered in the 2016 US elections, or propping up Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria and combating French influence in Mali. Since 2015, Wagner mercenaries have been in Syria fighting alongside pro-government forces. Their troops were also in Libya, supporting the forces loyal to General Khalifa Haftar. The Wagner Group essentially provided everything from security training to political and military advice, intelligence collection, and combat operation.
Mr. Speaker, we have consistently condemned the Wagner Group, and we carefully monitor their actions in Ukraine and the wider world, as the Honourable Gentleman mentions. We have designated both the Wagner Group and its leader under our sanctions regime already, and we also support international mechanisms which hold individual mercenaries in the Wagner Group to account for violations of international law.
About 3 months into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Kremlin-controlled media confirmed that the Wagner Group was fighting in eastern Ukraine. The Wagner Group had access to fighter jets, helicopters and tanks, and Prigozhin boosted numbers by recruiting Russian prisoners. The mercenary group was behind many of Russia's crucial victories in the 16-month-long war, most notably regaining control of Bakhmut. So how did a person so important to Putin's agenda emerge as the biggest threat to his authority? It goes back to the war on Ukraine. As Russia's invasion faltered, Prigozhin became more and more critical of Russia's military leadership. He repeatedly accused Russia's defense minister and the head of armed forces in Ukraine of incompetence and corruption. He also refused an order from the Russian Defense Ministry to sign a contract which would have put Wagner directly under its control.
Нести без боеприпасов потери в Бахмуте. Бесполезные и неоправданные.
Then, on the 23rd of June, Prigozhin claimed that top Russian defense officials had bombed Wagner troops in Ukraine. That snowballed into a mutiny, which has left Putin shaken to the core. Ever since the rebellion, Prigozhin was called a dead man walking. He retreated to Belarus and popped up from time to time in Russia. Wagner fighters had already pulled back from the frontline action of Russia's war on Ukraine. Recently, a top general linked to Prigozhin was dismissed from his position as commander of the Russian Air Force. It's clear that there was no going back to how things were before the brief mutiny. But is the plane crash a deliberate, cold-blooded revenge by the Kremlin?